That's why I don't eat ham sandwiches anymore.
And we're at that note. We're back, everybody. Welcome back to season 8 of the Undisrupted podcast. Adam, that was an interesting conversation we were having beforehand. We won't let the listeners know what that was about. However, I do have an opening debate for you, not about ham sandwiches, but year-round school. Our kids are out of school, right? Your kids and my kids they all went out on Thursday of last week. We're recording this, folks. This is the Tuesday after Memorial Day. And so I started having this debate with my own kids. Like, would you rather have 12 weeks off for summer or 6 weeks off for summer and then little breaks throughout? I know your school district, you guys have like a fall break, but we don't have that. So what do you say on this debate? Should we do it? I mean, it's been around since agricultural times, right? That's kind of why we started this in the early 1900s.
Mm-hmm. Well, the weird thing, when you look at why we had summer break and why we're doing it now, it doesn't make sense. Like some of the rationale behind having breaks and having kids at home during the summer and summer jobs, a lot of that stuff is not as important anymore. And we keep combating this summer slide every year. We talk about kids having a drop off in learning and having to kind of get them back up to speed when they get back in school. So I'm not a huge fan. I know I'm an old adult now of summer breaks. I do like for vacations and that kind of stuff with the kids. But when I think about what's actually best for their learning, it should be kind of be a more balanced calendar where we have breaks throughout the year. Like I like how some school districts will do it where they'll be there for a 9-week and they'll have like a week off or a couple weeks off and then go back. I like that kind of schedule better than what we currently do. But I don't know. What are you thinking about it?
I mean, we had Brett on, remember, I think in season 1 from Australia. And I think the way they do it down there is pretty neat, where they do 10-week on, 2-week off, 10-week on, 2-week off. And then they do a 6-week sort of summer break. So it's not so long, but I like the idea of like having those couple of weeks. So teachers, you can catch your breath. Technology leaders can catch up on things that they need to update and fix. And so it gives us a chance to kind of make little plan breaks throughout versus what I used to do, which is like once I knew the school year started, I knew I couldn't really shut anything down until maybe winter break to do some sort of big updates or anything like that. So it was always challenging for me. But enough about what we think, Adam. We have a guest here waiting for us. He's the CEO of CoSN, Keith Krueger. Welcome to the podcast, and tell us where you land on this debate, Keith.
I think CoSN is the Switzerland of this particular topic. Official position, but I think it's a great question to ask, and it doesn't make any sense that just because we've been doing it to continue with this agricultural mindset, and there aren't a lot of kids that are going back to be on tractors and things like that in the fall. So I think spacing some things out probably makes sense, but that's not an official CoSN position.
That's Keith's position,
what is it? The views expressed on this podcast are not that of CoSN. Let's go ahead and say that as we know Keith pretty well, but we're going to make sure we're not going to get him any hot water.
Like I heard CoSN said they want to go to year-round school.
Yeah,
we got
sound like that. Clip it.
Yeah. But to your point, though, you mentioned tech directors. That would be something that would drive them kind of crazy, though, trying to figure out how to do some of the updates and things that we do going year round. So those breaks would be important because you would need some baked-in breaks to give them enough time to kind of fix some of those things and update some of the infrastructure that we look forward to, because the summertime is really the busiest time for a lot of our tech leaders out there.
That's right. Absolutely right.
So, Keith, for the listeners out there, I'm sure they all know what CoSN is, but if they didn't know, kind of give them a little background, because for those of you who don't know, Keith has been around CoSN for a couple of years, just to say, a couple of years.
Yeah, well, CoSN is a nonprofit, national, or to some extent we would also do in Canada, but we're the professional association for EdTech leaders. By that we mean, school system leaders, like at the school district. Generically, we call them chief technology officers, although they have lots of different titles. And you're right, I've been with CoSN almost all of its 30 years.
That's impressive. Yeah. And we've, I've had the good fortune of going to several of the events that CoSN puts on. A great spot for, again, meeting and connecting with like-minded technology leaders all throughout the different fields. Like you said, Keith, it's not just CTOs. There's a lot of folks that are there. I saw recently though you had that your 2024 State of EdTech Leadership Survey, and I know it's always neat to see some of kind of the discoveries and findings. I can already guess. I'm not gonna let Adam know if he hasn't seen it yet. I'm not gonna let him guess what the number one key finding is, because we could probably both guess what it is. But tell
It
us a little
hasn't
bit more.
changed for 7 years, Adam, so you probably can guess.
Yeah. 99% of districts continue to be the top concern. However, there's a new player on the block, Keith, that has been, I just noticed on the takeaways, it's been rising quickly, especially in the last 2 years. Tell us a little bit about what are some of the key findings?
Yeah, so cybersecurity is the number one,
Okay.
and it's only been increasing as the number one with strength over the last several years, and not a surprise given what's happening in the attacks of ransomware through phishing attacks. This is the first year that we've started to ask about artificial intelligence, surprise, surprise, and that moved into the top 5. It was number 4 of the major concerns. But actually, there's also been a rising concern around privacy of student data, which I think is highly related to kind of the flip side of cybersecurity is privacy of data and having policies and procedures around that. The interesting thing, last year was our 10th anniversary of doing this survey. This is the 11th. And we looked back 10 years ago and looked at what the top 5 concerns were. Not a single one of them was in the top 5.
Oh, what were some of them? Give us a couple.
Bring your own device was the number 1 concern 10 years ago.
Oh, wow.
Number
Yeah.
2 was getting schools connected to high-speed broadband. Now, network design still continues to be in the top 5. So, but anyway, it just goes to show in this world where you all live and I live is constantly changing. And if we're solving yesterday's problem, it may not be tomorrow's problem.
Yeah. It's amazing how fast all that, just thinking back, and then of course the pandemic, of course, accelerated a lot of those challenges of bring your own device became supply your own device, and now we have the new challenge of now ESSER funds that were used to fund all that are running out, and so now how do we make this sustainable over time? Because it's great, we got connected finally, and we got everyone devices finally, or mostly everyone. Now what, right? That's the big challenge.
Yeah, and I think that issue of home connectivity outside of school, which is really important. I think some other research we did about last year looked at actual data on the school network, and more connections happen outside of school hours outside of school than at school. So unfortunately, the students that don't have that access tend to be the poorest families, tend to be disproportionately Black and Hispanic. And we also found it disproportionately affects kids at high school. About a third of school, we talk a lot about the unconnected, but it's also underconnectivity. And about a third of high school kids are underconnected or unconnected. And to do something like what we're doing right now with video conferencing would simply be impossible.
Yeah, that was one thing I think became front and center during the pandemic, with a lot of people realizing that it's not just about the connectivity, it's that high speed connectivity and data. How much data can you get to every house when you have multiple people trying to stream, get on Zoom meetings, or just watch TV? Because you had that happening in some households. They were trying to watch Netflix and also have a Zoom meeting at the same time, and they just couldn't handle that within their homes.
Well, it's a great point. And we also, using real-time data from school districts, looked and were able to demonstrate to the Federal Communications Commission that their definition of a highly connected house was 25 megabits down, which is fine for watching Netflix, but only 3 up. Well, that wouldn't even have worked for if you had 2 people at home, let alone when mom, dad, and several kids were trying to do it. And so we were pleased a month and a half ago, the FCC listened to us and updated the highly connected home to 100 megabits up and down. So that is significantly different than what we saw as we started the pandemic.
That's one of the things. I think a lot of districts look to CoSN to kind of say what's the standard. In our space, we're always trying to figure out, okay, well, what should I do? What's going to be
Right.
the standard when there's not a standard out there? And so, a lot of tech leaders, CTOs, they look toward CoSN to see what's that standard. What should we be aiming for, shooting for? So with that being said, as we talk about AI, Eric, what things is CoSN doing in the field of AI to kind of give
Yeah.
district leaders some focus?
Well, interestingly, last fall we partnered with the Council of the Great City Schools, which are the big urban school districts, and we released what was called a Gen AI readiness assessment. This was version 1.0, but we identified 93 binary questions: yes, no. Are you doing this? And we organized them into 6 domains, because AI is not just a technology, something that the technology leader has to fix. There are policies that the superintendent has to be involved in. The chief financial or business officers need to be involved in the procurement, and whoever handles data needs to be involved in that. Your legal has to be involved. So that first AI readiness assessment was very useful for all school districts, regardless of size. What we put out about a month and a half ago is a maturity tool on top of that. So if you haven't looked at it, it's pretty amazing. It will say not only what those 93 indicators are, but where you would be if you were at an early stage, a middle stage, and a more advanced, mature stage of doing that. Now, all that said, no school district is at a mature stage at all levels. And so what's valuable, I think, is teams of people from school districts. And I was just out in Peninsula School District last week, outside of Seattle, and they brought together their superintendent, their head of curriculum, their head of professional development, the CTO, and they they did a readiness assessment, and then they said, where are we today in our maturity, and where do we want to be, in a year? And I think getting that roadmap is so important, because, and I think there's such a panic sometimes that,
Right.
oh my God, we don't have an AI policy. And what we've been saying is, let's just take a deep breath and look at what policies we have and whether we need to update them. There's a lot of anxiety among teachers and parents about cheating with AI. Well, question number one is, do we have an academic integrity policy?
Right.
Hopefully you do. And if you do, how does that need to be updated in order to do it? Secondly, if we're concerned about how students use things, well, we have acceptable use policies. Just in almost every district, almost every student and parent or guardian has to sign something at the beginning of the school year. So let's update those policies first, and think about, realize that we have to be very cautious about cementing in policies like that are board approved, which might be well intended and really smart for today, but make no sense in
Right.
next week, next month, next year.
That's so valuable. I think when I work with a lot of schools around AI, that's they get really hung up on that part, Keith. I'm glad you mentioned that, because it is making it a one-off versus folding it into everything you already have existing already sets it aside to have, there's going to be all sorts of problems with it if you have it kind of, especially if you name specific tools. It's like quick change every 5 minutes.
Well, and we got to stop having policies for a specific technology. We need to have policies about practices and behavior.
There you go. I mean, it's always the big P versus the little P. You have the policy, something you're voting on, something that's written in stone, versus your practices and procedures.
Yes,
that's really where the rubber meets the road, in the practices and procedures.
And
I love that.
Guidance is probably a better term. Put out. And we see a lot of school districts doing this kind of red, yellow, green kind of which, yes, if you want to use AI for this particular purpose and you disclose it and your teacher says that it's allowed, that's fine. It might be yellow if depends on what you're doing with it. Maybe it's
Yep.
good to create a lesson plan, but you should not just take everything and assume that it's accurate and true. And then there are things that are red. Do not take a IEP of a real student and put it in the open internet. I mean, that is probably illegal under FERPA and just a bad idea. That said, when we looked at that survey that Carl, you were asking about the state of EdTech,
Yeah.
the number two opportunity that the heads of technology see is to more personalized learning. So there is great opportunity towards doing that. We just have to be careful that we don't put personally identifiable information in the open internet.
Right. There's so many opportunities. I think this is the first time I've been saying this for the last few months. Like, I feel like we've been talking about personalized learning for decades in education. And now, if done right, if we do it right, and we've had a lot of missteps before this, so hopefully AI will help us get to that. This question is kind of a little bit different. I know that, Adam and I, well, Adam's not as long in the tooth as I am when it comes to education. But one thing I noticed is that all of my friends and colleagues, they're aging out, let's say, of these positions. So they're starting to either go work for companies or they're retiring outright, which is great. And I'm excited for them. However, I start to worry, like, what's happening on the back end of that? Like, how are we cultivating new leadership? How are we getting, new people into these fields and kind of opening the doors and building a bigger table, for our job, and also diversifying that? Because I feel like, it's been long the job of the white male seems to be the CTO, but we've been working hard on that. And I know that you at CoSN, you guys have a couple of different initiatives around diversity, but also how to cultivate those new leaders. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, the Early Career Academy is really a terrific program. It's a year-long effort that happens mostly virtual, although they do gather at our annual conference. And you end up with a mentor. You end up hearing from some key experts in the field, and then talk about, and what the most important thing is that it creates a community for you. Suddenly you know who you can trust and turn to, that is, when you have things that come up. And I think there's all kinds of things that there is no written curriculum about. How do you best communicate with your superintendent? How do you not talk tech, but talk ways that the non-tech people will understand. And then long term, of course, we have our certification, the Certified Education Technology Leader, CETL, which over 1,000 heads of technology have received. You have to be in the field a few years to go for that, but I would strongly encourage, kind of everything CoSN does is based on that framework that creates it. It's the only practice-based certified, ISO certified certification in the world for EdTech leaders.
Yeah, having that in place, I think, is so important, because as someone who, I remember when I first came into the field, I was looking for my village. You're always looking for someone to be able to ask that question of, or even the questions you don't even know you need to ask yet. It helps to have that thought partner to be able to bounce ideas off and say, hey, had you thought about this? I mean, simple things like device collection. Mm-hmm. Unless you've done it before, you don't know all the ins and outs and things you have to deal with trying to collect devices, or what happens when you don't get all your devices back. How do you present that to your board, or your superintendent, letting them know that, hey, we had 3% shrinkage this year? What does that look like? So having that big brother, big sister, if you will, within an organization, within that mentoring program, does come in handy for a lot of tech directors.
Well, and I think one of the reasons the path to being director of technology or head of technology is quite different. About half of the people come with an education background, about another 45% come with a technical background, and then miscellaneous come with an MBA or a military background. But the actual job of what we generically call a chief technology officer, yes, you need to understand the technology, but then you also have to understand how it applies in education, and how do you have an impact on teaching and learning. And third, and just as important, if you want to sit at a cabinet level, you need to have leadership vision. You need to understand policy, things like privacy laws or funding for E-rate. So all of those pieces come together to provide your value. It isn't just understanding the technology. It isn't just understanding the classroom use. It's pulling it all together.
And you mentioned the gathering of folks together at a conference. I know you just had one in Miami recently, and the next one's going to be in Seattle, I think, next year. Tell us a little bit about, if I'm a leader and I'm attending a CoSN event, what are some things I should be expecting? What's going on? What are the happenings of your event that kind of make it a little different than most of the other ed tech conferences that are out there?
Yeah, our annual conference is for key decision makers and their teams from school districts. So, there are lots of great conferences at the state or even national level, obviously with ISTE and things like that focus on classroom practice. I think the unique perspective of CoSN is we come at it from the system perspective. So things like equity, things like privacy of data, things like cybersecurity, things like equitable use of AI. Those are things that an individual classroom or school perspective can't do alone. And so we try to also make it appealing for your superintendent, your head of curriculum, come together as a team. And we also have chapters, in lots of states, and they also do events. We just had them last week in Indiana, and I think Illinois just had theirs, and Texas is coming up. So there's lots of opportunities to find your community.
Awesome.
Yeah, I love that, having the decision makers a part of the process, especially when you start talking about having superintendents and heads of curriculum understanding how important some of this stuff is. Because as you mentioned, that number one concern of data privacy, security, that's something that everyone needs to understand. It is not just a technology issue. No. It's not just a technology concern. It's just basically data privacy of everything.
Yeah. And we have a SEAL program, which we've had for a number of years for school districts. It's called the Trusted Learning Environment. But to be very honest, it's very difficult for a school district to reach all 25 practices. So just the last few months, we've started a mini SEAL program so that people can start to see, school districts can start to see some progress. So I'd encourage everyone listening to the podcast to look at CoSN's Trusted Learning Environment SEAL and get started. Get areas that you think you're doing a good job and get recognized for it, and then create some momentum. Yes, it's a lot of work, but it's absolutely essential.
And you didn't want to call that mini SEAL program a baby SEAL, right? Because that's too easy. We don't want to hurt that at all.
Maybe
that was T
nice
right up there.
Yeah. Might be a nice logo.
Yes, there we go. Adam,
okay, so
yeah.
So here we go, Keith. This is the last question for you. This is one that we ask everybody kind of coming in on the show. And especially as we are getting into this summertime where a lot of people need some time to recharge and as people say, get their mind right. Mm-hmm. So what is something that you do to keep yourself undisrupted?
Well, definitely taking a little time off, having some fun. And we're going to go to see the first few days of the Olympics. So I'm pretty excited about that.
Awesome.
Yeah.
That's fun. Where can we learn a little bit more about you and your organization?
Yeah, just CoSN.org and follow us on X or LinkedIn or any of the other social media.
Awesome. Thank you so much for being a part of the show. And for the listeners out there, be sure to subscribe and give us a review. We'd appreciate it. We might even give you a shout out on a future show. This has
now hold on a second, Carl. Hold on a second, Carl. I want to make sure all of our listeners can find Keith, because Keith is always going to be at events. Now, but he does kind of stand out sometimes walking around those events because he's normally wearing a hat on his head. So I'm surprised. I'm a little disappointed he didn't have one on
did
just
not
now.
Rock the hat for those of you listening. We do not have Keith on with a hat, or like a very bright. He sometimes have a vibrant shirt on too.
Well, I'm trying to keep up with you guys.
There we go. Yes. So look for Keith and his hat at a future CoSN event, and you might even see him. Will you be at ISTE this year, Keith?
I will, and just don't call me an empty hat.
Oh, there we go. Don't club the baby seals and don't call Keith an empty hat. Okay. Again, thank you so much for coming out. Thanks for being a part of the show. And this has been the Undisrupted podcast that Adam just interrupted, but it is Undisrupted. Brought to you by Alfred. He's Adam, and you can still follow him on the X or the Twix or the Twitter or whatever at AskAdam3.
And he's Carl, and you can follow him at Mr. Hooker. And remember, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls of all ages, we are better together.
And we are better
undisrupted.